Hastings, the last battle of the Vikings. 9/11 would be a decisive year for France, and also for Roland the Blacksmith, a Viking who was imposing because of his enormous physical dimensions. On that date, the Norwegian and his Vikings reached an agreement with the Carolingian King Charles the Simple, by virtue of which Charles granted Roland a part of the Frankish kingdom of Neustria. From then on, the region of French land became known as Normandy, i.e. the land of the Northmen, and Roland was the first Duke of Normandy. A century later, one of those dukes, William, would lead an invasion of England from Normandy, and during that expedition, one of the most decisive battles of the Middle Ages would take place: Hastings. Everything came to a head in the year 1066. On January 5th, on his deathbed, Edward the Confessor designated Harold Godwinson as heir to the throne of England. That same Harold, however, had made a trip to Normandy only a year earlier, and there, Harold had given his word to Duke William that he would help him occupy the throne of England after King Edward's death. Apparently, Harold changed his mind when he was recognised as successor by Edward himself, but William had not forgotten the Anglo-Saxons' promise and prepared to conquer by force what he conceived as his own, the crown of England. However, William was not the only competitor that the new king of the Anglo-Saxons had to face. Along with the Norman, the Viking king of Norway also took advantage of the uncertainty of the English succession to try to seize the island. Thus, in 1066, 3 warrior leaders were to engage in violent warfare, all of them with the aim of conquering the crown of England. The Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson, Duke William of Normandy, and the Norwegian king Harold Hidrada. It was a duel of giants from which only one could emerge victorious. Aware of the double threat looming over England, Harold saw William's threat as more pressing, so he marched south to repel the Norman invasion. Fortune did not favour him. Bad weather in the English Channel prevented William from setting sail for several weeks, while Harold Hidrada's Norwegians did cross the sea and landed in England without encountering resistance. Taking advantage of the circumstances, the Viking advanced rapidly to Europe. Then, at the gate of the city, the armies of the Earls of Northumbria and Mercia came upon him, but the Vikings fought them off and won. Consequently, York surrendered to them. Luck seemed to smile on Harold Hidrada, who now had England practically under his control. But it was then that Harold Godwinson reacted, doing so with incredible agility. He left the south coast and turned swiftly northward to confront the kings. During that lightning march, his men covered about 40 kilometres a day, managing to catch up with Harold's troops on September 25th, only 4 days after the Viking landed recall. The battle between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings was fought at Stamford Bridge early in the morning. Of course, the latter did not expect the Anglo-Saxons and were caught by surprise, being completely destroyed. That day, King Harold Hardrada himself was killed in battle. One of the 3 candidates for the throne of England had just been neutralised. But Harold Godwinson barely had time to rest and celebrate the success of his successful coup. 2 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, William and his Normans crossed the English Channel. They landed on the south coast of England and began to build motte castles from which to support the invasion of the island. Then the Anglo-Saxon again mobilised his men and repeated the extraordinary march that had won him victory over the Norwegians. And so, in record time, Harold appeared on the hill of Senlac, an elevation he considered perfect to deploy his forces and stop William's forces. The battlefield was set. Harold orders his Anglo-Saxons to adopt the shield wall tactic. Knights and infantrymen were to fight on foot, overlapping their shields in a very compact formation. Together, they constituted a kind of human castle, but equally impenetrable. And certainly, the Anglo-Saxons had everything to gain. They had chosen the battlefield. They dominated it from their advantageous position in height, and besides, they all had war experience. They had all recently fought at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. They were warriors with a strong bond of brotherhood among them, and with enough courage to remain unharmed in the face of the most savage of cavalry charges. And to give greater cohesion to the shield wall, in the centre of it fought the Royal Hussars, the elite corps of the Anglo-Saxons. Many of them fought with heavy two-handed bearded axes, with which they could decapitate a horse with a single blow. Together, they formed a pair perfectly designed for defence and attack. Finally, on October 14th of that year, 1066, William reached the hill of Senlac, 12 kilometres from Hastings. Then the Normans saw the imposing wall of shields that crowned the horizon. Against that massive infantry, bristling with spears and axes, the Normans' main strength lay in their cavalry. In fact, William's was the best cavalry in Europe at that time, and it was also made up of skilled and experienced warriors. Each rider was protected by chainmail, helmet, and a large kite-shaped shield, while his main weapon of attack was the lance. Their heroic cavalry charges were known from Sicily to the Holy Land. Hastings would be, in short, the confrontation between two forms of warfare, that of the infantry, typical of the armies of antiquity, and that of the cavalry, which would be typical of medieval times. It was William who began the battle. At dawn, he divided his cavalry and the Normans charged up the hill in waves, relentlessly. But again and again, the horsemen collided with the shield wall, without managing to break the resistance of the Anglo-Saxons. Usually, in medieval times, battles were decided in a short time, but at Hastings, they were fought for hours. Surprisingly, the English resisted and repulsed each new onslaught. The Normans, on the other hand, charged, retreated, and charged again, without managing to break the enemy, but without weakening their own spirit. According to the William of Poitiers, who was present, this was a strange kind of battle. One side was all nobility and initiative, the other resisted as if it had taken root in the ground. At last, exhausted one and all, the rumour spread that William was dead. Then, the leader of the Normans took off his helmet to deny the rumour and charged again at the head of his men. Again they spurred their horses and threw themselves uphill, against the shields bristling with arrows, against the bloody axes, against those immovable Anglo-Saxons. But this time William dared to execute a different tactic, much more risky, a feigned retreat. The idea was to charge and simulate a retreat to push the Anglo-Saxons into pursuit. If he could not break the enemy line by force, he could break it by deception. The physical pulse was to become a psychological pulse. The Normans feigned retreat, but the Anglo-Saxons did not follow. They remained at their posts. William had failed. William tried the same tactic once more. Surely, he would have no chance of carrying it out a third time. It was his last option. The Normans charged, pretended to retreat, and then many Saxons took the bait and rushed in pursuit. At last, the iron shield wall had been dismantled. By the time they realised the deception, it was too late. The Normans turned and swept them away. Chaos ensued among the surprised Anglo-Saxons. Trying to regroup his men, Harold himself died of an arrow in the arm. Shortly after, William was crowned William I, the Conqueror, King of England. That victory earned him the conquest of a kingdom. And this is the end of the video, like a great night at the theatre introducing the main protagonists. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and leave a comment about what other character, battle, event, or historical curiosity you would like us to cover. I hope you enjoyed the video as much as we did. See you in a few days. Bye!